Welcome to the Middle Age-ish podcast. Authentically and unapologetically keeping it real. Discussing all things middle-age-ish. A time when metabolism slows and confidence grows. Join fashion and fitness entrepreneur Ashley Bedosky, former Celtic woman and founder of the Lisa Kelly Voice Academy, Lisa Kelly, licensed psychologist and mental health expert, Dr. Pam Wright, and highly sought-after cosmetic injector and board-certified nurse practitioner, Trisha Kennedy Roman. Join your hosts on the journey of Middle Age-ish.
Hello and welcome again to another episode of Middle Age-ish. My name is Trisha Kennedy Roman, and I'm joined here today with my co-host, Ashley Bedosky, Lisa Kelly, and Dr. Pam Wright. And this episode, we're going to be getting a chance to talk with Lair Torrent, who is a marriage and family therapist, and we'll be talking all about marriage and family and love and all that stuff.
We've been there. We've done it. We've conquered it. Maybe.
Maybe. I was going to say maybe.
I mean, it's a work in progress.
Yes.
Speaking of love, happy anniversary.
I know. Happy anniversary.
And here she is celebrating here with us. How many years are you married? 20. 20.
Oh, this is a big one.
And you're hanging out with us until your date tonight.
But no wonder, guys. I know you guys can't see her, but she looks so gorgeous.
Smoking hot. You have to still date. You still have to make it a priority and an importance.
Yeah, you still need to get butterflies.
Right.
We don't date at all. Self and Scott don't do, like, literally, because just the way our schedule works. So we actually never have, like, date night. Maybe twice a year we would go out.
Well, like you said, he's coming home early for your birthday and stuff. So, like, he makes effort.
Little things.
Absolutely.
But that's the thing. Like, I don't think that dating has to be any type of grand gesture. Like, when I say dating, it could be Michael and I sitting on the back porch for 30 minutes before we pass out and fall asleep. Mm-hmm. But just that one-on-one. I'm looking at you. I see you. I hear you. It doesn't have to be any, to me, it doesn't have to be like a super fancy, oh my gosh, we're
or just about the kids. Yes. He's getting the kids here. So if it's all about the kids and never about, hey, I love you. Hey, I miss you. Hey, what's going on? It's all about just transactional analysis about the kids, then it tends to lose its luster, I guess.
See, I wonder, at least with you and Scott, like if it's because you guys, that's kind of how your whole marriage has been, is you guys touring different things. 'Cause you guys remind me of like a teenage couple as far as just how much you adore each other and you're fun. And so I think probably you guys just got accustomed to being able to survive like that,
we spent long periods apart. I mean, I toured, I had the kids with me on the road from, like, the whole time I was there. So I was 7 years on the road, and the kids were with me, and Scott wasn't with me. So, like, I would spend a really long time away from him, and he'd come over and visit every couple of weeks, maybe. Like, the longest I think we went was maybe 2 months. I think sometimes people do think it has to be grand gestures, update.
Yeah,
I know people are sitting there looking at other couples and measuring it up against other couples and going, oh, well, they go out every Wednesday or they do this.
Oh, my crazy trips.
Crazy things. And you're like, yeah, but they hate each other.
Exactly.
I think it's just like you get it in your mind that this dating or like love has to take on these, like you said, these grand gestures. But that's so not true.
No. It's the little things.
Yeah.
It's communication.
Yes.
It really is. And trust. I will go on forever about how important it is.
You have to figure out what each person and the relationship needs. We see the world with completely different eyes. And what doesn't matter to me at all might probably be something that is super important to Michael.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then vice versa.
Right. Which is why communication, figuring it out, is so important.
I know. For the longest time.
I am a big believer in love languages, and words of affirmation is mine, and leaving like a little note on my car is as much as buying me a diamond ring. Like, that's huge to me. I love when I get my little notes.
But that's where you've come to. And isn't it amazing that that's where we are, is that we, like that we see things differently. And I think that's,
That's where communication, I always tell people, like, you need to ask for what you need. Yeah. And if you don't get it in return, then versus like, look at me and try to figure out what I need. They can't read your mind. No one's going to know that, like, Trisha's love language is positive affirmations. Like, you would never know
to leave our notes on her car now.
I know. I'm doing that as soon as we leave. Trisha, I love you, and thank you so much for creating the podcast.
I'm going to drive by tomorrow from the studio and be like, you are so gorgeous.
You are an amazing rock star, and we love you. But it's true. But if you don't communicate, you don't know. And people want you to read the mind. And I'm like, you can't do that.
1,000%, you can't do it. You're going to misjudge. You're going to make a mistake if you don't communicate, because you have no idea what the other person's thinking or what they need, like what makes them feel special.
It's funny, when James Priest had talked about, treat them like puppies, I find myself doing that. Like if he does leave me there, like, that meant so much. I think I really try to let him know, hey, I love that. So
you're like, I love you so much. You're so cute.
Here's your biscuit.
Yeah, exactly. Come give me snuggles. But it's true. I mean, because again, it's two entirely different beasts.
Yes. And when you think about it, two people that have come from completely different backgrounds for the most part, raised completely differently. Right. Like Scott and I were raised in different countries. Like it's just, when you think about it, and you're expected to come together and everything to, work.
No.
And it's so hard.
Because it's not like a TV show.
No.
It's not.
Or a movie. It doesn't work that way.
It's a bit better now that you have all these resources that, you didn't even 20 years ago. We didn't have. No. But, I can see even watching, reels that come up on your Facebook and they're talking about love languages and they're talking about different ways to make people happy, or just even the fact that you have such good access to therapy. And that now as well.
It's so important.
Oh, yeah.
It's such a gift. Yeah. Because you're right. We had to muddle through.
You do. And you've no one to talk to. You don't talk to people about it either because you're so afraid of being judged.
Especially several years, like a decade, 2 decades ago. I mean, mental health. And that's part of it. You have to be healthy mentally to have a healthy relationship.
You have to have good trust and communication.
And that's hard. That's a learning curve all the time for everyone.
Because again, you go through life and you're going to break trust. I mean, that's the thing too. You're not going to have for me, I don't think that a healthy relationship just means that you've never broken trust, but you've worked through it.
100%. Yeah.
And I think that's sometimes when people bail is because, I can't ever trust you again. Okay, I just have to pause, and can I just say cheers?
Yes. Cheers that Trisha actually made the mic noise other than us.
But see, I toddler-proof cheers beforehand. I just toddler-proof myself.
You're going to come in one day and it's going to be a playpen. Just one of those little...
with bumpers around her.
Trisha, why am I sitting in the hallway?
Padded cell in the corner.
With an extension cord.
Funny.
Again, I don't know why I haven't been fired yet.
No, you're awesome.
Okay, clearly we're going to have to toddler-proof my station as well, but that will have to wait until next time because our guest is now here to join us. We are now ready to welcome Lair Torrent to the podcast. Lair is a leading marriage and family therapist and is the author of the book, The Practice of Love. He is a psychotherapist, an executive consultant, and speaker. He blends Eastern-based mindfulness practices and Western clinical models to create a powerful approach to healing. And he's been resourced and interviewed by NPR, the New York Times, and Rolling Stones for his expertise. He is in private practice and he works remotely with clients around the world. And we are incredibly lucky to have him here with us this evening. So, Lair, welcome to the Middle Ages podcast.
Hello.
Hi. Hello, Lair. How are you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being on.
Thank you.
So tell us about what you do, a little bit about your book. I know you do therapy, and I love your concept about teaching people how to really pay attention to the relationship.
Yeah, so I went to a school in New York called the Helix Training Program that was founded by 5 really amazing women back in 1970. And it was a healing program that really asked the people who were going to be would-be therapists to really look at their own stuff and never ask a client to walk a path that you're not willing to walk yourself. In that place, I learned a ton of different modalities, not just Western clinical modalities. And I liken it to have gone to Hogwarts. Crazy, eclectic, awesome, amazing experience, and terrible in all the best ways. And then after that, I went for a licensure program at Mercy College to become an LMFT. And while there, I had to, of course, do my internship. And I was working with couples because I wanted to work with couples. I had come from a socioeconomic set that typically doesn't foster a lot of loving romantic relationships because, when the economic piece is so difficult, often that breeds a lot of hardship. And so I didn't see a lot of romantic romance that I was seeing on TV and in the movies. I didn't see that around me and my family members, aunts, uncles, my mom. And so I think what I tried to do is I was really interested. I was an incurable romantic, I think, by and large, still kind of am. And when I went to school, I decided I wanted to work with couples, sort of unwittingly trying to heal something in myself that I was going to help couples heal in themselves, right?
Yep.
And so I sat down with my intern coordinator and I said, I think I want to work with couples. And she said, great, we all hate working with couples, so we're going to give them all to you.
Yes,
like, oh,
true.
Awesome, great. So I know I'm going to get my hours. Awesome. And so I was working all of the modalities. I was working the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. I was doing all the nonviolent communication you could think of. And I have to be honest with you, the people in my practice were loving it. It was going famously. They were hugging me on the way outside, on the way out the door. They were high-fiving me. They were backslapping. But before they got to the elevator banks in my building, that was going off the rails. Mm-hmm. And it was fine in session, but I've learned couples don't always play by the rules left to their own devices. Mm-hmm. And so I went to my teachers, I went to my colleagues, I went to my mentors, I went to all of them and said, this has been my experience. And they said, welcome to couples therapy.
Yeah.
And I said, well, we can't accept that, can we? So I happen to be being mentored by the very well-known Evan Ember Black, who, if you don't know her, she's written a ton of books in the space and is a very famous LMFT. Mm-hmm. I went to her and she was my mentor. I sat in front of her and I said, look, this is my experience. And she said to me, welcome to couples therapy. Mm-hmm. And I said, Evan, I'm sorry. You are the grande dame, the maven of all of this. You don't get that. You've been on Oprah. She said, I've been on Oprah twice. And I said, so you really don't get this answer. And so she said to me, go figure something out for yourself then. Go build something of your own. Mm-hmm. And so that was the origin of the practice of love. That's where I started to kind of cobble together my own way of working with couples that I find to be it's a blend of Eastern philosophy, Western clinical modalities that I think really do end up working. It gives couples something to use when their baser, most activated, most protective parts of self are up, when they are at their worst. If they can just have the wherewithal to reach or stretch and grab one or two of these practices, things tend to get better quick.
We touch a lot on the podcast just because the podcast name is Middle Age-ish. We're all middle age, at just how relationships really change at this point, because so much of your life and your relationship has been focused on kids. And then once kids get older, once you empty nest, then you kind of are left with each other. And sometimes you've grown together, sometimes you've grown apart. That this is an age that a lot of times can be very trying from all stages of marriage you have to work on, but especially I think at this point in your lifetime.
It's true. I say to people all the time, let's get on this early. Maybe they come in when the kids start getting a little bit older and they see them cresting that life cycle event of launching children into the world. And I'll say to them, look, you don't want to be the couple that looks across the table after the kids shut the door and say, you look remarkably like someone I used to know.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. True. So true.
Yeah, that's
very
often
true.
what happens.
Yeah.
I'm a psychologist. That's when I see people come in for counseling the most. They're like, oh, our kids are gone. And now we look at each other and we're like, who are you? Like, what's your interest? What do we do? Right.
They're strangers. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like they don't know who that person is. That person doesn't know who you are.
Right.
So, yeah, you literally can be looking at a stranger because gone through, it could be 20 years. I mean, that's a lot of growth.
Right. And change.
Yeah.
I like that approach. So you talk about coming in before that point happens. And I think just like with medicine, it's better to treat things before you have a problem.
Right.
And I think that a lot of times you don't think a counselor, a therapist is more like a 911 call when there's a problem. And boy, it would be really great if we kind of looked at that as to keep things healthy before it ever gets bad.
Yeah, it's better to be proactive than reactive.
Mm-hmm. That's so true.
Without a doubt. And so I get that intake call and I'll ask him, I'll say, so tell me where you are. Are you 2 wheels in the ditch? Are you is your relationship in the ambulance on the way to the hospital? Where are you? Mm-hmm. And hopefully it's none of the above. Hopefully they're like, every so often I get that call where they're like, nothing bad yet. We just noticed that we're having some, boilerplate communication problems. We just wanted to get in before the issues started. People tend not to be, at least in our culture, I think in the United States for sure, they become more reactive and they wait till they are symptomatic to your medical point. And that's when it's that final push. And I always say, the phone call to us is probably one of the last ones they want to make. They'll talk to their friends, their family, their colleagues, boss, who know, they'll talk to anybody rather than make this call. Thankfully, I think therapy is becoming a little more normalized. Mm-hmm. You don't have to feel like something's wrong with you to have a therapist. And I actually come from New York, where everybody has a therapist.
Right. That's what I was going to say. That's crazy to me that you say that, because we just think, not from being from here, we think all Americans are in therapy. Like, it's just
no, all Americans should be in therapy.
They are. It always seems that every American goes to therapy. When you see stuff on TV, when you're not from here, and you're going, oh my God, everybody goes to therapy. Because I know it's definitely still a taboo thing. Not a taboo thing, but like in Ireland, there's certainly not as many people go to therapy that should go.
Yeah, that ask for help. That's a rough one for people. Yeah, I think to say that we don't. I don't think you should have the answers. I don't think we're necessarily born knowing how to do this. Mm-mm. I mean, we know how to love. Perhaps that comes from the heart center, but really making a relationship work with all the trials and the tribulations, that's a skill, and that's one of the reasons why I called the book The Practice. Right. I wanted to emphasize the fact that this should be something that you think about every day, that you think about all the time. And it's like, my God, you'll go and get help from a golf pro on your slice, but you're not going to go and talk to someone about the fact that you can't get along with your partner, or like, I don't know who this person is now that we've launched the kids. We don't have a lot of common interests now or commonalities other than the children.
Right.
And so that life cycle event is often about like rebuilding that connection and finding those places that we do find commonality, right?
Mm-hmm. I'm a big analogy person. I absolutely love that what you said about with your golf swing, because it's true. I mean, what's more important, your golf swing or your lifelong relationship? And so to be able to put work into that, I mean, it's a visual. It is a visual.
It's a daunting one, though. It's because I'll go to the golf course, or for me, it's surfing, but I don't play golf. But people will here in Charleston, everybody golfs. But they'll go to the golf course because it's such an escape from this daunting thing that now we have to turn face. And it's like, I get it. Not many people understand what it can do for you. And it often looks like a painful process. Some things are going to get said that are going to be hard to hear or hard to say. I think it's hard to jump in that pool both feet.
Mm-hmm. And everyone's trials and tribulations are so different as well. I think we were talking about that earlier, when you're going from relationship to relationship, and you're going into a new relationship, and what you did in your previous relationship, everything is so different, and it takes such a long time for you to get to know somebody and to get to know how it works, and then you're thrown into another situation. So it just makes sense for people to have. I never, genuinely, we've never been to couples therapy, but before getting married at home in Ireland, you have to do a 6 weeks therapy course before with the
6
Catholic.
weeks.
Yeah, 6 weeks pre-marriage course.
Actually.
Yeah, but it's with Catholic priest. You have to do the 6 week pre-marriage course before.
I'm Methodist, so we didn't have any of that stuff. We didn't have to meet with our minister. Nothing. Wow. I mean, we literally at 22 embarked on such a crazy, uncharted journey. We're from Missouri, so I mean, a Methodist from Missouri, we didn't have any of that stuff. They were like, just sign the paper, say I do, and off you go.
So funny.
And like a lot of marriage and family therapy is brief therapy. And I've always sort of I get it, I guess, but I find that the stuff you're probably bringing forward. So first of all, Catholic priests, unless they're trained, they're not going to be able to touch the surface. They're going to be don't do this and do that.
Right. Exactly. Have lots of babies.
Yeah. Right. That'll make it all better.
Yep. Yes.
Of course. Put a kid on it.
20 kids, you're good.
That's the sign of a really good marriage.
Yeah.
Right. But that brief therapy for me, it's 6 to 8 weeks, perhaps you're just gaining some trust, especially if someone's reticent to come to therapy at best. The thing I try not to do is get involved in refereeing anything that's on the surface. Mm-hmm. I try to drill down below the waterline. It was Sue Johnson in her book, Hold Me Tight, said it best. She said, therapists and the clients that they serve are really only willing to go to the waterline on so many of the issues that they really need to dig into. And so for me, below that waterline are things like, was I loved? Was I safe? Was I enough? Did I matter? And so we're coming into this relationship unconsciously with these parts of us, these younger wounded parts of us, trying to fulfill this thing unconsciously. And so, I know you're fighting about what happened last night at dinner. But really what that's what you're fighting about. But what you're fighting for is the fact that you've never felt like you mattered, and you've never felt like you were enough, or some version of that, of those four. And so in my practice, we really do try to not look. I'm not trying to look for annuities in my clients either. I don't want to keep them forever.
Yeah.
But
everyone needs to move on.
Yeah. And I always tell because they'll say like, how long will this take? And I said, well, that depends. My job is to make my job obsolete. And the best relationships I have with clients are the ones where, they graduate out after a fashion, and I'm a trusted person in their relationship that they can call when they feel like, hey, we want to get an extra set of eyes on it. We trust Lair. He knows the story. We can hit the ground running with that guy. I love those relationships that I have with my clients. Years out, I'll hear from them and say, hey, can we get back in for a couple sessions? Of course.
I think that's a huge thing, though, when you see a therapist as well. It's so important that they already know how you are and how you work, because I can't imagine going from therapist. I know people do and sometimes have to go from therapist to therapist, but I can't imagine having to spill your guts again.
Well, it's a trust factor, I think, because in my opinion, for therapy to really work, like you were talking about, you have to get to the actual root cause of why behaviors are triggering or, why you do react to something. So you have to have some level of amazing trust, because it's very humbling. Yeah. I don't think a lot of humans are willing to put themselves out there to be hurt, to be judged even by a spouse.
Right.
I think it's amazing that, you can have that relationship, because I think to me, that would be crucial to be able to move forward successfully.
I think a lot of men in particular come to the door thinking, man, I am going to get ambushed. Yep. I get these men in the room and can begin to build trust. And I set the tone early by saying, look, I'm probably going to say some things. I'm going to need to say some things. I'm going to need to put my shoulder into you from time to time. So I'm not going to do it today, but I'm going to try to build enough trust that you'll let me lean into you a little bit. And so often, and I try to be kind of brass tacks and very outward about very, very clear about what the process is going to look like. So there's not any curveballs, and we're not here to jump you here.
Yeah.
And that's when they leave and they never come back.
And the woman is wanting them to be ambushed because she wants to be right.
Right. Well, exactly. She wants you to tell her and tell him she's right and you're wrong and you need to apologize.
Yes. Right.
No, there's nothing can be gained from that. Right. So we're either arguing for the victim position or trying to win the fight. And so that's when I tell them, look, guys, this needs to be a zero-sum game. Because if you lose and you win, you both lose.
Yeah, you both lose.
Vice versa.
Yeah, win the battle, lose the war.
Yeah. And so for me, and I talk about it in the book too, that the competition within competition really can't live in love. You have to be wanting. Why would I say to them, if you really love this person, why would you want them to lose anything?
Right.
Including a fight with you.
Right.
Yeah. I think that's easier to say as well when you get older, and that you have that perspective. I think when you're young, that's one of the big things when you're young, because you do want to be right, and you do.
Well, you think you're right.
And you do want to be better than people at times. Right. So, but I think I certainly know just from my own perspective, I think as you get older, you mellow a little bit as well, and those things being right isn't always the most important thing. Anything for a quiet life sometimes. Okay, fine, you win. You do.
Look at the boneyard of relationships behind you, right?
Yeah, right.
That to kind of lean in.
Exactly.
True.
Very well.
Yeah. Exactly.
I'm going to try something different. Maybe I'll try this not being right all the time, or arguing for the victim position.
Yes, or I just won't listen. That's what Scott would say about me all the time. She just doesn't listen.
She's just nodding her head.
Just nodding her head.
Yes, honey.
Yeah,
yes, absolutely.
Of course, I'm listening.
So if you had someone that was young, Ashley was talking about getting married at 22. What would you say would be the top 3 things you would, pointers you'd give them if you were talking to some young person getting ready to be married?
So, yeah,
that's a tough one.
Well, no, I'm trying to pick one. I'm trying to pick just 3.
Right.
Yeah, no, that's what I'm saying.
So many.
I know when you get married that young, you're like, oh my God, where do I start with the help that you're going to need?
Well, I want to start with personal responsibility.
Yes.
Right, because for me, and I don't know if I'll find agreement on this one, but for me, and I really dug into this one, if there's no personal responsibility taken, if I can't point the finger back at myself and say, you know what, you're right. I was not my best self in that moment, or I did speak to you in a manner that was not okay, and I shouldn't have treated you that way. If there's none of that, if we can't own that, and that I'm owning that I'm bringing some of my stuff to the table, without ownership, without personal responsibility, there is no relationship to actually be had. I mean, you can stay together and there's some facsimile of a relationship, but you're really in relationship to something else, not the person's heart. And so personal responsibility is probably the number one thing that I would teach, and that actually ends up being practice 5 in the book, which ultimately ends up being the common denominator practice. The one that's, if there's one that's most important, maybe that's it.
I think it is. Yeah.
The second one I'm teaching is probably mindfulness. Right. And these feel probably like, couples therapy adjacent, but, and I will say this, and I say this in the book too, is that couples will say that you're like the Mr. Miyagi of couples therapy. I'm waxing on and waxing off here. When do we get to do the, what I think I heard you say technique? And we don't get to that until we do a couple of things. One is, can I be self-reflective? Because if I can't be self-reflective, if I'm constantly looking at you and saying, this is what you're doing, then I can't, stop the things that I'm doing that aren't awesome, and I can't onboard any new habits, right? I can't do any of the thing this therapist is asking me to do if I'm not self-aware. Maybe I can do it in the office, but I'm certainly not going to do it in my life. And the third one, if I had to pick 3, is I'm going to work on parts. What part of you shows up? I don't care what we're doing in life. I do this a lot in my coaching and in my business talks, but it's certainly important in your relationship. I think the most important question we can ask in any situation we are in is, who in me shows up? What is being reflected back to me in this experience? I start talking about, like, how do you protect yourself? How do you fight? Who are the wounded children in here? What's your inner critic like? Right? Because those are the ones that are going to come to play if we draw that Venn diagram of your relationship, and there's that shared almond of whatever it is you're discussing, interacting over, or dealing with. The part of you that shows up there is going to predetermine how you guys relate. And so when people come to me and they do this to you guys too, we have communication issues. I'm like, you don't. And they're like, no, Lair, we've been to the house. We know we don't communicate well. And I'll say, you've communicated the fact that you don't communicate well to me just fine.
Right.
So you have full articulation of the English language. What you have is a parts problem. And so for me, we in the psychological field have been putting the cart before the horse. You cannot ask a person or a couple to use a nonviolent communication technique, or any technique really, without being able to say, who in me shows up? Like, what part of me is using this? Because if you're in the wrong part, if I'm in my protector parts, what I think I heard you say turns into, what the frig did you just say to me, very, very quickly. Yeah. And so we will weaponize that technique. And that's part of the reason I say that, before they got to the elevator banks in my building, that was going off the rails. That was true. They were weaponizing the techniques I was teaching them, because they were in these protective aspects of self. And so that would be the third one I would teach.
I feel like that just doesn't count for 20s. Like, those 3 things, I feel like could be from some of our friends that we've talked about, like going back to the couples who all of a sudden wake up and they're like, I don't know you. I don't think I like you. Like, those were like amazing. So I don't know if I would just say that those would be just for 20.
Would your advice, like your top 3, would that change for someone who is, say, middle age, who's going into another relationship or another marriage? Would you say that would still be your top 3?
Or trying to keep a marriage together.
Yeah, I mean, I still start there.
Yeah.
Because I think they're good roots. But the fourth practice that I offer in my book is, and in my practice, is a practice that I call choosing, and it dovetails off of emotionally focused therapy. And then when people hear it, they're like, "Oh, you mean the love languages?" And I'll say, "Well, sure, if you must."
Not exactly.
Not really.
Not the same.
They're not the same. And so I say, yeah, it's important to know, like, how we feel we receive love and how our partners receive love. That's important to know that language, sure, but that's only part of the story. It can become very transactional if we're not careful. And so what I want to know is, like, okay, so if it's physical affection or words of affirmation, whatever they are, I want to know what that's attached to. And so when we really look below that waterline, what we find out is, it's like, yeah, I feel something when you, and I dig in and find out what this is. Sometimes I ask these questions right in the first session. which is, am I safe? Am I loved? Am I enough? And do I matter? And typically, not always, but I'm going to say about 80% of the time, you'll see someone hitch. When I say those, I'll say, as best you can, don't think about these questions. I want you to try to drop into your body and feel about these questions. Were you safe? Were you loved? Were you enough? And did you matter? You'll see somebody hitch, or someone just go blank. And they're right, because it hits. People cry in my office for a great many reasons, not the least of which is when you hit the truth button.
Yeah.
And when you hit a truth button that goes to that depth, sure, your love language is important, but it's attached to that. And that's not what you're fighting about. That's what you're fighting for. And it's really important to know what you've been fighting for and all those relates, like the second marriage thing or the third marriage or whatever it is, this, you're trying to have this relationship that finally works in your latter years. You need to know what you've been fighting for.
Yeah.
And your partner needs to know what that is too. That's the Da Vinci Code to your heart.
Right.
And so knowing that, I think, is really, really important.
Yeah. So in couples therapy, I was trained in Imago. So Imago, like what you've been dealt with or what you've dealt with in your past, comes into your future, right? So what I've dealt with, and you could trigger, my spouse, my partner, by saying something could trigger things from my past. So how much of that is concurrent with what you're speaking about? I mean, it's kind of similar.
A lot. And so what I'll do with them is I'll say, and this is the point when you can start seeing your partner not as the protective warrior, princess or warrior person who's saying some not great things or calling you out in a way you don't love. You do, obviously, we want to make sure we're not being abusive. But when you can start to kind of, I always do this, I kind of look, I'll say, oh, who's that back there? It's this little girl or little boy in you that didn't get something, right? It's what Carl Rogers called unconditional positive regard. We would come out of the womb looking for that. And he said, as you probably well know, he said, your clients are missing something in that regard. So for me, I wanted to define exactly what that was. And so in my research, I found I came to the conclusion, right or wrong, I think I might be right, those 4 questions, right? That somewhere it's packed in there.
Yeah.
And so when we have a core wound, like I was not safe or I was not loved, the psyche splits, right? And so it becomes a wounded child aspect of self, and that part goes off into shadow. And so it's looking for the thing it did not get. Right. And so I try to help my couples really discover that piece you're talking about, like what happened back there. This is where we can really feel seen, really feel heard, really feel understood in a way perhaps we never have before. Because now I'm not seeing you as the person who is like arguing with me. I'm seeing you as a person who's just fighting for this. This is when I first discovered this about my wife. I was reading Stephen Johnson's book, Character Styles. If you haven't read it,
it's good.
You have. It's
great.
For me, it wasn't an easy book to get through, but man, it'll blow your hair back. I felt like I had gotten the answer key to my wife. She was just my girlfriend at the time. She was in school too. And I was in my New York apartment. She came home and I was reading Johnson. And I had read what I thought was her character style. And what it said was, this person, because of her, deep-seated childhood trauma, has never felt safe in the world. And I was like, oh my God, this is unbelievable. And so she comes bombing through the door, having had a terrible day, and she was practically in tears. And so I got up from the table and I walked over to her, and she was like, I think expecting me to do the fixie thing that I tended to do back then. And rather than try to fix her, I dropped the tool belt, wrapped my arms around her, and I whispered in her ear, I said, I know, sweetie, sometimes the world just seems like an unsafe place. She pulled back from me as though she was like hugging some alien man into her house, right?
Like, who are you?
Yeah, who are you? Who's this guy? And she said later, I have never experienced feeling more seen before in a relationship.
That's so important.
I knew right then I was onto something. Like, man, like it's not about winning. It's not about being arguing for the victim position. It's about seeing beyond those protective aspects of self, the inner critics that may come out, and looking and going, oh, I see you. You're just fighting to know that you're safe enough. And I get that. I can have compassion for that. Right? I can have empathy for that.
Yeah, I love that. That book is amazing. It's a great book. So for people who are middle-aged, because I'm a psychologist, but I do some couples therapy, but probably more individual. And a lot of my clients say, we really need couples therapy, and I can't get him, her, whatever partner to come. What do you do? And what do you, I mean, I know that happens a lot, right? But what do you do or say to that individual who really wants to work on it and try, but they know that their spouse or partner will not come in?
I say a couple of things that are maybe fairly controversial. I have a real problem with someone who says, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to read that book. I'm not going to take that course. I'm not going to listen to that podcast. And I'm certainly not going to go see that quack you just asked me to go see. Right? They're telling you that they're not fighting for you.
Yeah.
If your partner says there's a problem in the relationship, guess what?
There is.
There's a problem in the relationship.
Yeah, regardless if you see it or not. It's
right.
for them. Yeah.
No, it's not just about you. So, it kind of pisses me off, as you can kind of tell.
Yeah.
It's like, how do you not fight for this person who's just asking that we try to fix this, who's fighting for us? And so I'll say to these people, if this person's unwilling to do this, you have a couple of choices, right? You can recognize this as not an orange flag, not a blue flag. This is a red flag.
Right.
And now it doesn't mean you have to leave. You can do three things. You can readjust your expectations and understand that this is what you're going to receive. And don't expect anything else, because when you bring that expectation down to where perhaps you mitigate some of your suffering, or you can go home and pack your stuff. Conversely, you can go home and pack their stuff, because there's not really a relationship. Falling back on that answer I gave you earlier about personal responsibility.
Right.
You've got to own your stuff. You got to grow up.
Yeah.
And so if they're not willing to do that, you should know that you're worth more than that. And so when I have a client in the room and their partner's not willing to do that, I'm like, how does that make you feel? That they're not willing to show up. They're not willing to do the hard work. Their answer is their answer, but I know I have mine.
Yeah, it's very sad. I see that a lot with people, and I think it's really hard to know, because then you're at a crossroads, right? You have to make a decision one way or the other, but it's really hard when that person won't listen to your thoughts and your beliefs and sadness about the relationship.
Yeah, and I don't mean to be glib about it and to say that's an easy decision, because I don't think it is. But it's you have to value yourself enough to know that, like, that person I don't think is willing to fight for me and for us.
What 3 signs would you say for, especially middle age, when people need to come in for therapy, they need to do that kind of checkup and that work? Because I agree with you, doing it before problems hit is great, but that's not necessarily the case. So what kind of things do you see where you're like, okay, these people really need to come in and get some counseling or therapy or work on things?
Well, if there is everyday sort of like grousing, where the communication is just off the road, like we can't talk about anything, or we can talk about the weather. I literally had a couple tell me that the only thing they're allowed to talk about is the weather.
Oh Lord.
Everything else is far too incendiary. I'm like, wow, how is that? How is that sustainable? So if there's, there's some good studies out there recently, and I cited on my Instagram account about, how impactful it is on our health, literally on our health, to have poor communication that's just even a little bit every day, or the acute poor communication where or the fighting that happens and it's big. It doesn't happen all the time, but it's big. Or the couples who say to me, we never fight.
Oh.
Right? Yeah, that's a scary one.
That has to be a scary one, because that's just not reality.
I hear that a lot, though.
I know.
You're obviously both playing nice, and that for me is very often a systemic of some trauma where you couldn't bring your feelings into the room. Why can't you bring your feelings into the room now? It's not if you fight, it's how.
Right.
So those pieces, and I don't necessarily say sex is everything, but if sex is off the rails, and you're not talking about it, that's a good indicator that we probably need to be chatting about some things.
Do you feel like that's a common problem as people get kind of older? Again, probably a lot of times there's a gap with a lot of that when you're busy with your kids. Do you feel like that you see people coming in, again, empty nesters with issues of how do you get the fire back in that?
Yeah. And I actually just did an online course with dating divas, they let me choose a topic, and I chose sex, how to keep sex sexy across across a long haul. I see that a bit coming into my practice, as well as people coming in sort of having lost the fire, that the tension is gone for various reasons. I like to say that mortgages, you make a couple of people, got a car payment, you've been together a long time, then sometimes we lose that tension, right? That sexual tension. So how do we build it back? I think one of the key pieces is the narrative. The stories that we tell about our partners are really, really important. In my book, it lives as the cautionary tale, because catching those thoughts is like catching wind in your hand, and you have to be practiced at it. to notice when you're looking on your partner, because look, life is going to happen. Gravity is going to happen. Age is starting to happen. We want to be able to look upon our partners with kindness and compassion, empathy and understanding. We want to be graceful in those thoughts. And we want to give a lot of grace. I already said that, but grace in that regard, to look upon them and to know that to do that is such a loving act, to mindfully construct that story about who they are sexually, who I am sexually. So important to be able to work on that. And so when I see that as part of the issue, reconstructing that and using that narrative therapy piece where you go in and you reauthor a new narrative, that takes some really hard work. And it takes a lot of responsibility, personal responsibility on the part of the practitioner, the client, to do that out there in their lives. Now, I can say from personal experience, like I had a number of girlfriends growing up and throughout my life, my 20s, and they, a lot of them were, when I look back, they were really great people. I built narratives about them that were not so awesome. And so pretty soon it was like, well, I knew when I met my wife, I wanted this to last for the long haul, and that included the physical connection. So we've been together for 22 years now, 2 kids later, a couple of major storms, hurricanes and dogs, with that, all the stressors of
dogs, right?
Yeah.
Oh, those little furry, fabulous things.
And I knew I wanted to be able to keep that spark alive, right? And so, how do you do that? And so, I went on a campaign up here in my own brain to make sure I was cultivating a narrative about her body, her sexuality, all of it, that was kind, compassionate, empathetic, and understanding. And it was fair. It was loving. And that's really worked for me, and it's really worked for my clients.
Good.
Your book, I'm fascinated with your book. I mean, the different pointers you're making are awesome. Can you break down the chapters of your book or what it entails?
Sure. So when I was building it, I knew the first thing I wanted to put into it was Eastern mindfulness practice, right? Because I really felt like it was something that was missing from our Western clinical modalities by and large. And so having people stop being able to push pause, that's the first practice. And that helps to regulate the nervous system, but it also gets us looking at ourselves rather than our partner, which was kind of revelatory. And so you start noticing, what am I thinking? What am I feeling? And so noticing what's going on for us inside is the first step, because from that place we can get out of our knee-jerk response to each other. It's a really, really powerful practice for couples. The next one, I thought, well, we can't just have one practice for a modality. We need another one. And so parts work was it was on the test the year I was getting my license, and it was just sort of an honorable mention. And so I dug into that, into Dick Schwartz, his work in IFS. But then I found out that, like, going all the way back to Freud, Jung, Virginia Satir, there's in all so many modalities that we know, there's some version of parts work. And I just thought it was really interesting to ask, like, who in me shows up? What parts of me are in there? And again, I'm not looking across the table at you yet. And so the next practice is the narrative. What's the story that part's telling? If I'm in a particular part and I'm telling a narrative, those thoughts become feelings, those feelings become thoughts. And if I leave that on rote without being mindful and aware of it for too long, I've created a belief system about who you are and who you are not. And I thought, man, if we could get a hold of our parts, if we get a hold of our narrative, man, we're cooking with gas. But, and so people were finding that, like, they weren't losing that spark. They were staying connected longer. They were communicating well because they were working on their parts. But there was this like, how do we love each other better piece? And so I started digging into emotionally focused therapy. I actually wrote my graduate thesis on emotionally focused therapy. And I thought her work was really awesome and amazing. Her and Les Greenberg dovetailing on, Bowlby's work in emotionally focused therapy and attachment theory. But how do we love each other? And so I thought it was important to be able to understand not just how I experience being loved, but love is not just a thought or a feeling. There needs to be a conveyance for it. And it needs to touch into not just their on the surface love language. It needs to touch into their heart, into their wounding. And for me, that's almost the spiritual nature of a relationship. That when someone reaches and stretches in our direction and shows up for the parts of us that no one claps for, including us, man, that's something else, right? Yeah. And so there I was. I had these 4 practices, and I thought, awesome. Mindfulness, parts, narrative, choosing. We're cooking with gas. And then I noticed no one was doing it. And so I thought to myself, what about a little stoicism, right? I thought stoicism is really just mindfulness with a mohawk and a few tattoos. It's really kind of
Love
cool,
it.
right? Yeah. And so I dug into some stoicism, which is, kind of over the kitchen counter, kind of homespun advice. Like, you need to do this stuff. You need to take responsibility for your mindfulness, for your parts, for your narrative, and for your choosing your partner. Now, that's only part of personal responsibility. You have to also own the stuff that comes out of your mouth, the things that you do, the things you say, the things you don't do, the things you don't say. And so this is where people really started pushing back on me, because it's like, personal responsibility feels a lot like blame. Blame feels an awful lot like shame. You're asking me to admit to things that I don't want to admit to. And so people were saying to me, well, you're asking me to give up ground. And I said, no, actually, I'm not asking you to give up ground. Personal responsibility actually gives you the higher ground. It's the ground of emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
And what I found in my own life, and I cite a lot of this, a lot of my own experiences. I take myself to task a good bit in the book of where I've messed up, not where I was awesome. And what I found in my own life is that personal responsibility, though it's a difficult road to travel, it is the road less traveled. But it is, of course, as Frost liked to say, it is the road that made all the difference. And that's been true for me, and I think it's true. And I don't put it on the front of the website because no one would come.
Well, I'll tell you, I've been looking at your Instagram, and you put on just really great little nuggets. I love your videos on Instagram. So when we put this episode out, we'll definitely put a link to your Instagram as well as the book, because it sounds like a great book. I want to get your book. It sounds wonderful.
I had to audition for the audiobook, by the way.
Awesome. Well, we really appreciate your time. I think this has been really great. I think this is really important, especially for our age group, to just, to talk about this, and we got to keep
real.
Yeah, got to keep putting in the work for our relationships.
That's right. Thanks for having me. It's been really nice talking to you guys. If you ever want to have me back, I'm in.
Awesome.
Oh,
we
would
love
love
that.
that. Yes, thank you.
Resident marriage therapist.
Yep.
Yes.
I think we all
Amazing.
need that at some point.
All right, great. Well, have a great night. We really appreciate it.
Yes.
Thank you,
Best
Lair.
wishes.
Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye. I really liked him.
Oh my gosh, he's amazing.
That's good.
I thought his little nuggets and were could be again across the board, no matter what age you are. I feel like
He's the first I've really agreed with. If your partner won't go to therapy, if all these things are going on, he's red flags. And it's true. You have to really look at those things.
I'm still stuck on the golf lessons.
So true. So true.
I think that's what's so amazing.
Yeah, I can't go to therapy, but I'm going to play golf.
Right.
I'm gonna go work
if
a
you
golf
put
cart.
a visual in your mind, then it's going to make sense.
Yeah.
Well, we all want to matter, right? And if you don't matter enough,
Yes.
if you're, again, he said, if somebody says they have a problem, you have a problem, whether you don't feel like it or not, there's a problem. If
They have a problem.
Yeah, if your partner feels that there's a problem. And so to not, if someone is asking for help or asking for therapy and you're not willing to do that, I would think that would feel really awful, like you really don't matter.
Oh yeah.
Well, I think that it confirms that you don't matter.
It's true.
It's very hard.
I mean,
That's what you were saying. I can't imagine going to Scott and go, I think we have a problem. I think we need to get it fixed. And I'm going, no, we don't.
I'm not interested.
all the time.
But I'm going to go see the golf pro tomorrow.
He won't come with me. He will not come, or she will not come, or they will not come.
But I
All the time.
So sad.
Happens all the time.
We do all want to feel heard and appreciated and valued. And if that's your spouse's partner's response, then I would think that's a big red flag.
Huge.
I always say it, but all of our podcasts kind of build on each other. And, several podcasts will talk about toxic relationships. And I think that it's so hard a lot of times for us to really, realize we're in a toxic relationship. And I think that what he was saying about, if someone's not willing to go to counseling, you've got a few options. But I think that sometimes it's not worth hanging on to a relationship if they're not willing to fight for you.
Yeah, I agree. And I think knowing that as well, that you get to that point and go, okay, well, if you don't want to fix it, I'm out. And I know that's so much easier said than done. I'm just a believer of calling it quits when it's to be called quits.
But it's sad because, again, we talk about, not feeling, the self-confidence piece. And if you don't feel like you're worth it, then you're not going to feel like you should,
you can leave.
You can leave. And so I think that that's gosh, just finding yourself and knowing you're worth it and not putting up with any BS like
people
that.
do put up with that for a long period of time. But he's right. I mean, if you look
that didn't just start overnight where you have a spouse or a partner that devalues your opinions and your feelings. That is something that is cultivated over years. And I think that that's why women in our age group they get to that point where they don't feel valued. It does matter to be heard. It does matter to be loved and appreciated. No matter how many years they might have gone through it, not feeling that way.
At this point in our lives, when you're in your middle ages, things have changed. You look older, there are wrinkles, gravity. There are things that have changed. I mean, I'm definitely not as sexy as I was, when I was 20.
I beg to differ. But see, that's the thing. I think confidence is super sexy.
Yeah. But you either are confident in yourself to where that doesn't matter, or you're still struggling with that. And so I think it's the people who are struggling with that are still willing to take not being appreciated, not being heard. And so I hope everyone gets...
Well, it's like knowing your worth.
More confident, knowing your worth. Yeah, knowing you're good enough.
But that's why we're doing this. Like, that's what we talked about the very first night, is the bridge. Yeah. You've got, like you talked about, like, you've got the women who have come into their own. I mean, not that we're still not on a journey of learning, because we are, because we're still here. But we have, like, it's innate now that we know who we are, and we appreciate that, and we value love and happiness and peace. But that's only a portion of the women out there. And I think it's beautiful if there can be a bridge for the ones that are still just struggling a little bit behind, that you just turn around, put your arm out, and you bring them with you, because that's, again, this is why you wanted to do something like this, is to bridge that gap and make middle ages not scary.
And you're not your worth. And it doesn't matter what you look like, weight-wise, wrinkle-wise,
because
whatever.
We are all going to age. That is the one thing that is guaranteed in this life, is you're going to age. And you either embrace it, but that comes with confidence, and it comes with life lessons too. Like, every single one of us sitting here, we fought to get where we are. Yep. And we struggled, and we fell, and we had to pick ourselves up, and we had a village. But some are still a little bit behind. So I think just having that arm and hand to just be like, hey, you know what? You're not ignored, or
you're worth it.
Yeah, you're worth it. You're heard. So...
Well, cheers to keeping the fire alive,
everybody.
And being enough.
Exactly.
Knowing you're enough.
Yes. Love you guys.
Thank you for joining the ladies of the Middle Age-ish podcast as they journey through the ups and downs of this not young, but definitely not old season of life. To hear past episodes or make suggestions for future episodes, visit www.middleageish.com. That's www.middleageish.com. You can follow along on social media at Middle Age-ish. Also, if you have a moment to leave a review, rate, and subscribe, that helps others find the show, and we greatly appreciate it. Once again, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll catch you in the next episode of the Middle Age-ish podcast.